because the actual truth about this is kind of mind-blowing. But everything I'm telling you is true. And so I heard of some of these things when I was young in the 60s. So I also saw one of these objects pretty close up in about 1963. I was about 8 years old. So I always had an interest in this, and even being a medical doctor and an emergency doctor, trauma, I kept my interest up studying it. But when 1990, I started an organization to really dig into this more deeply, and by 1993, I had been asked to brief the director of the CIA for Bill Clinton. Now, at that meeting, I learned that the president and the CIA director and others had been denied access to these covert programs that I knew were going on at my uncle's old company and elsewhere. So it was then that I realized that there was a criminal element to this, a very illegal type of management of a very important issue. And that when Clinton inquired about it, and he eventually got approached by George H.W. Bush, the former president and former CIA director, and he was told, this is none of your business, bug out, just get lost. And I know this for a fact. I have an affidavit from a man who was with Bill Clinton after he left the presidency, and he's a very well-known Hollywood figure and another a singer who was in the limo with Bill Clinton when he shared what happened. And the problem with that is, if you're going to decapitate the presidency and the Congress on something this important, then basically you're setting yourself up as your own entity, and you're going to operate outside the law. And if you operate outside the law on something this important, you are dangerous. So it's a very dangerous game being played. Now, most of the information on the subject is nonsense. I found out that there were covert programs that were staging alien abductions and mutilations. Everyone thinks those are aliens doing that. So no, it's not. The CIA special projects and some other special operations people. How are they doing it? Let me give you a date. October 1954 is when we mastered what's called gravity control. You can take an object, put an electromagnetic field, boom, and it flies, like these videos you see that the Pentagon has released and confirmed that they're real. So that was 1954. So by the late 50s, early 60s, these were platforms or advanced technology aircraft that don't use jets or rockets, highly classified. And the other reason for the secrecy, I'm going to tell you right now, is to sort of create the specter of a threat from outer space, which doesn't exist, by the way. It's totally a fraud, for the purpose of amassing more military power globally, by staging a threat from outer space. And remember, if you look at our documentary Unacknowledged, which is still up on Amazon, all the platforms, it details how Werner von Braun, who invented the rocket for Adolf Hitler, on his deathbed begged a member of my team, Carol Rosen, to expose the fact that they were planning to stage an alien attack and to look like we're under some sort of threat. And it was all a false flag, totally a false operation. And that the purpose behind that would be to amass huge amounts of geopolitical power, sort of in a totalitarian way, through military operations. So this is a little bit like the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam, where we staged the attack on our Navy vessels so they could expand the Vietnam War, when, of course, the American public was against it. So these sort of what are called false flag operations happen quite a bit. And what we have to be sure is that the public understands all this, but also the members of Congress and White House. So it's a very complicated problem. And if you Google this subject, I'd say 90% of everything that comes up is just nonsense, frankly. But there's a core of it that's true. And there are extraterrestrial vehicles and civilizations. There are advanced aircraft that are anti-gravity based on ET craft that were studied, flying around. I'd say probably 80% of the UFOs people see are actually ours, but they're not acknowledged. That's why we named that documentary Unacknowledged, because it's the first word in unacknowledged special access projects. And the unacknowledged SAPs are the ones that are off book, deep black, etc. And they deal with this. And this is a real problem, because in my meetings with senior members of the Senate and House, and also White House and cabinet level people over the years, as well as Pentagon folks, I mean, they are not allowed access to those projects. And if they push too hard, they get threatened. It was like in 1997, I briefed the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Wilson. And I had given him a portfolio of documents and information that I have that are in our book, unacknowledged, if people want to see them. And he ended up, because one of those documents had the project code names and numbers from the early 90s, from Nellis Air Force Base, Area 51. So he made some inquiries, and he got hold of one of the offices. And he said, look, I'm Admiral Wilson, I'm J2. They said, oh, yes, sir, we know who you are. And he says, well, I want to be read in, which is military speak for briefed on this subject. And they said, sir, you don't have a need to know. And he said, excuse my language, he said, God damn it, how can I not have a need to know? I'm the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They said, sir, we will not discuss this with you any further. Cut the line. And then he pushed further and got threatened personally, and threatened with losing a star and being demoted in his position as an admiral. So this is the sort of thing that I've been firsthand involved with for 30 years. It's just now coming around that the American public is awakening to this in a serious way, and the Congress, to their credit, are really trying to get to the bottom of it. Yeah,
that's a lot.
Yes, I would say, well, depending on where you are. Certainly if you're out in the high desert of California, if you're in certain locations where we have these assets that come and go, yeah, there's a very high number of them. Perhaps in other parts of the world it'd be lower than the 80, but we do know that these advanced technologies, or some people call them ARVs, alien reproduction vehicles, because they're man-made devices based on studying in part the extraterrestrial devices, spacecraft, are more common, and they're actually, over the last 60 years, have become more and more refined to where the average person would be completely deceived about whether it was an extraterrestrial or alien craft versus a man-made one, which is in and of itself very dangerous, because, if you look at those pilots who were, before the hearing last month, I spoke to David Fravor, who was one of those two pilots. And, as jet pilots, they were not read in on the fact that Lockheed Skunk Works or Raytheon, other corporations, had these devices that could move that way. And so, their assumption that all of those had to be alien, but they're not. So, it's a very complicated picture, only because your people are forgetting that we now have in our archive 122 cases where we have shot down using electromagnetic weapons these ET craft, and I'm sure that number is much, much higher. Well, what does that mean? If you retrieve that kind of technology, and you've got virtually unlimited funds, and some of the brightest scientists in the world working on the problem, you're going to have huge breakthroughs from the 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way to now. And then those get turned into devices that could absolutely deceive the public about something happening that looks like an alien attack on a village in Brazil, right? You heard this whistleblower, Mr. Grush, say that whole operation was a covert human operation, staged to make it look like it's alien. So, one of the things in 1991, I had a guy deep in the intelligence community came to me and he said, Dr. Greer, if you tell the truth about this, it's less believable than the fiction we're selling. And, that really is true, because the actual truth about this is a kind of mind-blowing. But, everything I'm telling you is true. It's not that many. I mean, it's not like every single day, in any given geographical area, there's swarms of these moving around. But I'm just saying that a lot of the ones that have been seen and thought to be of extraterrestrial origin are not. And then there are ones that actually are. And you have to know enough. And they're very rather distinctive. Now, the more advanced the man-made ones get, the easier it is to confuse them with an extraterrestrial one. And for most people, if they see something at a great distance, they see a light or some object moving erratically, they're not going to see enough detail to know whether that was one of ours or something from another star system. And this becomes a huge problem, because if policymakers and people at the Pentagon don't know that, then it would be very easy to trick everyone. And so there are two big, I think, overarching reasons for the secrecy. One is the technology and science game, where they're keeping this secret because they're protecting $1,000 trillion worth of oil and utilities and coal and nuclear power plants. The other is this game of trying to eventually let this come out, but spin it in the direction of this false narrative of there being an alien threat. So those are the two twin pillars of the secrecy since the 1950s. I found in my archive from 1993 or 4, when I recommended to President Clinton, after I briefed his CIA director on this, that these projects were being run illegally in big corporations that were keeping the UFO issue secret, the technology secret, and that the best way to do it would have a amnesty period where they're notified you have to bring forward your technologies, the spacecraft you've retrieved, which are extraterrestrial in origin, the man-made spacecraft that are running off of reverse engineered technologies, and they got to do it or be criminally prosecuted. So that an amendment to the intelligence funding bill came out of the Congress after our National Press Club event in June, and it got also out of the Senate, I think, pretty unanimously. Right now, it's being held up until the House comes back after recess, and the House of Representatives, if they approve it, then it'll become part of the law, and that will start a clock ticking where these large corporations are going to have to cooperate with the inquiry and turn over what they have, or be subject to criminal prosecution. So that is something that is on the table right now, moving through Congress.
Okay, what do you mean by large corporations? Like who?
Well, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, EG&G, SAIC. We have all those corporations, operations pretty well mapped out, know where they're happening. We have people who've been on the inside, who've worked on these technologies. Other companies that are involved, General Electric. We also know that both GM and Ford have had components of their projects that are classified dealing with this issue. Now, what the public needs to understand is that if you're the president or chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee or members of Congress, you're not told about any of this. I mean, of course, this is completely illegal. So the programs that are run dealing with this UAP, UFO issue have been unconstitutional since the late 1950s. And that's what we're trying to rectify and fix. Oh, it's easy. I mean, first of all, the government's huge, complicated. The people who are in political office are pulled in 1,000 different directions. And the funding mechanism is very interesting. We had a woman who worked for SAIC who worked in an office where they would have all this money coming in. They would sort of gin up reports, just fake reports that go back to Congress and to auditors. And the money went through the back door into these unsanctioned illegal projects. So the public has been getting ripped off for probably over 60 years with these sort of programs, 65 years. And, it's a mistake to think that even the people I work with in Washington, I'm here in Washington right now, who manage what's called the black budget of the United States, which is the very secret part of the budget dealing with covert operations. And I've been meeting with those people, and they're not briefed on these issues, but now they know that it's real and there's something going on. So I think the public needs to put aside their fantasy high school civics lesson about how government runs and realize that Eisenhower wasn't too far off the mark when he said, beware the military-industrial complex. And when Senator Inouye, who was the chairman of Intelligence and Foreign Relations, said that there's a secret government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own funding mechanism for funding that's above the law and free from the law itself, I'm quoting. So I think that, this is a huge problem, and the consequences for every person on the planet are huge, because you think of the fact that the technologies that we document in this documentary, The Lost Century, those technologies have been around for over 100 years. I'm talking way beyond what you're looking at with Tesla-type cars. But the real Tesla, Nikola Tesla, he had these sort of technologies, and they were suppressed back in the 20s. So, we need to move forward, because if this issue gets resolved properly, it's not just that we're not alone in the universe, is that the technologies that get us off oil, gas, coal, nuclear power, wind, solar, these battery cars with 900 pounds of lithium-ion batteries that are so damaging to the environment to make, all that'll be a thing of the past. So now that's part of the problem, because you're talking about a multi-$100 trillion macroeconomic issue, right? Money and power. So the reason the secrecy exists is that kind of corruption, but on a very large scale. I think there are now key members of the Senate Intelligence Committee and Armed Services, as well as members of the House that I'm meeting with, who understand this and are really wanting to move quickly to get to the bottom of it. Yeah, I mean, there are two big issues. One is what I just mentioned, power and money. Like if it were to be disclosed that you look at the Pentagon footage of these Navy jet pilots of chasing one of these objects off the coast of California, that thing had no jets, no rockets, no nuclear power plant on it, no heat signature. I mean, the infrared, meaning detecting heat, was zero. So how is it moving? against 100 and some mile per hour headwind at that altitude? And how is it making right-hand turns and going straight up and down? Well, that's an electromagnetic propulsion system that deals with the very high end of physics. The energy that drives those machines are called the zero-point energy field, which is energy from the space around us. Tesla called it the infinite energy field. So the question really becomes, how long are you going to let these sort of people keep these technologies away from the public when the pollution and the biosphere is being degraded and half the population of the Earth is in poverty? And the disclosure of these technologies and this information would completely change that. But imagine you're a multi-trillion-dollar oil company, or have interest in the petrodollar system, et cetera, and so on. Or you're running a public utility. You're talking hundreds of trillions of dollars in assets that run the planet, but it's running the planet into the ground. So there needs to be sort of a new industrial revolution where all those old smokestack industries get replaced with these very high-tech new physics technologies, which already exist. I mean, they don't have to be developed. They've been developed for decades. So when the public learns what's behind the secrecy, that's when they're really going to push to get this disclosed properly and get to the bottom of it. The organization that keeps this secret is global, and they have operations in countries all over the world. It doesn't really respect international boundaries. The very first thing I said to the main investigator for the Senate Intelligence Committee here was, look at the map on the conference room here that we're in, take all the lines off of it that are between countries or states. This organization moves with alacrity across any national boundary. And they have assets all over the place, but they don't respond to democratically elected offices here, UK, Australia, all over. And anyone anywhere in the world that were to independently develop one of these technologies, those will be confiscated. And if you look at this documentary we just released, The Lost Century, and how to reclaim it, you'll see documented where there are a number of people who have been killed because they had a technology that would be, quote, free energy. It'd be something to sit on the table here, and it would run your house with no electric bill and no pollution. And the energy is coming from the fabric of space around us. It's called the zero-point energy field, which, by the way, was first postulated in 1930s and proven in early 50s. So, this is in the main physics journals, by the way. The so-called levitation anti-gravity technologies began to be experimented with by T. Townsend Brown in the 1920s. And we have the physics journal reports of him creating lift or levitation using very high voltage systems. So once those technologies began to be combined with our studying of extraterrestrial vehicles that we had shot down, then it really took off in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So when I say that we're literally 100 years behind where we should be technologically and socially, it's really true.